Hi, and welcome to this Southeast Leadership and Lifelong Learning CPD for Coaches. We have put together a series of videos on coaching through crisis and recovery, and if you check out our channel, you'll be able to see the other resources there. Today's work is going to be around looking at specific tools that might help support you in your coaching. And I know that this is going out to the Southeast coaches and mentors, but feel free to get in contact with us and connect with us through the email address below. So we've been working with Rebecca Giffney on this series, and she's with us again today, I'm delighted to say. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca as we move through this one. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Kerry. That's fantastic. And as Kerry's already mentioned, this is part of the series of resources we've developed. So this set of slides linked very closely to the resource pack and also the first webinar that we recorded for coaches, which talks about a specific coaching approach called post-event or post-traumatic growth coaching. And the two tools that I'm going to share with you today link directly to that particular type of coaching approach and coaching method. So to get us going and a bit warmed up, I'm going to start to talk to us initially about emotion. So and actually how to explore emotion positively with the coaches that you're working with. And I want to touch on three elements of how to interact with emotions in a positive way, because I suspect during your coaching sessions at the moment, conversations that will include exploring and understanding emotions are likely to surface during your conversations with the people that you're working with at this time and in this context in particular. So on this slide, you'll see three things that I just wanted to touch on with you. And obviously, as a psychologist, how we think, our emotions and how we behave is really fascinating. And I really like exploring and understanding emotions. And for those of you that have worked with me in the past on programs, you'll know that I often use the analogy of an onion to explain the different layers and the complexity of emotion that we tend to experience. But what we don't tend to be that good at all the time is about being able to articulate and label the emotion that we might be feeling. So one really useful technique and approach to work with people on is inviting them to label the emotion that they may have felt or what they might be feeling. And this is really about helping them to identify what that emotion is and to be able to recognize it and acknowledge it. With this process of labeling, given the current context, I would probably advise a degree of caution around delving in too much around the analysis of the emotion. Because there is a tendency to pull people back into threat-based thinking. And I would just be really mindful of the analysis that you do, because actually the value with exploring emotion links to really being able to verbalize it as a way of acknowledging the emotion that they're feeling and also helping them to process and lessen the impact of that emotion by being able to verbalize that with you. So that's the first one, labeling. The second one is around reappraisal. Now this links to the fact that when we feel something, we often will automatically turn that feeling we're having, that sense of emotion, into a thought. So we cognitively process it and we give it a label. And emotions can either have a combination of both positive and negative associations that we do through that labeling. And through that labeling, it then forms into a narrative that we tell ourselves. And so with reappraisal, it's inviting a coachee to think about the label that they might have given an emotion, and are there any other ways that they might interpret or understand what they're feeling. I think the classic one that I often tend to use is that sense of nervousness. I feel really nervous. I feel quite anxious at the moment. And sometimes in certain situations and contexts, that emotion can be reappraised to be elements of excitement. And similarly, in the slide, you'll see that I've given some examples around actually sometimes people, feel that sense of feeling exhausted, and actually sometimes that reappraisal is around because of the passion that they've exerted and their determination and their commitment. So again, just helping people understand the narrative that they're assigning to what they're feeling and how they are retelling their story to themselves can be a useful tool to think about using as part of the conversations that you might have with your coaches. The final point, which is slightly different, but I think it's important just to remember, and for those of you that already practice mindfulness coaching, this will be something that will be really familiar to you, and that's about helping people to stay connected to the moment. So if you are having a coaching session with someone, it's about helping them to be focused on the present. How are they at this point in time as they are sitting or on a virtual call with you? How are they at the moment? Because often what they'll be sharing is their experiences of what might have happened or things they want to share, and that might be related to emotions they had then, but it might not be the emotion they're carrying with them at the moment. So again, just giving people an opportunity to tap into that those channels of emotional awareness, so they get an understanding of where they are at this point in time, and that sense of presence of where they are. The only thing I just mentioned, and again, this is just, we touched on this in the first session, is just to be mindful that when you are exploring and working with emotions, just being really clear around your boundaries and responsibilities as a coach in those conversations, again, and being mindful of what you have contracted with your coachee. Okay, so that was just a bit about emotion, and you'll see as we go through the next tools how those elements and approaches link into two of the tools that we're going to discuss now. So the first of the two approaches is called the Thrive model, and this was developed by Joseph, and Joseph was the same clinical psychologist that developed the post-traumatic or post-growth coaching approach, and this was a model that he advocated. And this model, is obviously the Thrive stands for an acronym of 6 steps, which I'm going to share with you now. But what's really important about this is a very much a recovery orientated coaching tool that you can use. And I would say as well that the 6 steps is a guided path through a conversation, but I'm not for one second saying that it's about a rigid keeping to all of those, but it's a useful framework again for coaches to be aware of as they're going through their conversation. So I'm going to talk through quickly each of those 6 steps and some of the sorts of questions that I might ask at each of those different points, just to help bring the tool to life and provide a bit more detail. So the first element is around taking stock. So this really is about how you can support someone to focus in on the resources that they've currently got available to them in terms of their psychological, physical and also social infrastructure, and helping the person to understand how they are utilising all of those resources that they may have available to them at that time. And for those of you that do any work around stress coaching, for example, you'll know that when the demands placed on someone exceed their perceived resources, that's when they move into that zone of stress. And this taking stock is about helping them to consolidate what are the resources available to them, which might be around the skills, the network, people. It might be about the clarity of their understanding. It might be about how they are communicating or being communicated with. So it's quite an all-encompassing discussion to have around those resources. So the sorts of questions I might use to kick off this lead into this use of this tool would be around, tell me about where you are now, what's happening currently for you, and who are you drawing on to at the moment? Who else is available for you to draw on for support at the moment? So sorts of questions that help them to explore where they are currently, what they're currently doing, how they're currently working, and how they're supporting themselves at this point in time. The next one is for the H in Thrive, which is around harvesting hope. So this is about supporting individuals to get glimmers of opportunities for growth or for the positive elements of what they're doing and how they're working at the moment. So it might be through the discussion, you might be asking some subtle prompt questions around, so what have you recognised about yourself out of this situation you've just described? Or what elements have you really valued about that? What was a small positive thing from your day last week or from that experience? What was something you hadn't realised until that point? So again, just helping to pose questions that might get them to think about elements within a situation that might be quite distressing and uncomfortable, where there were glimmers of opportunity for the future. I would potentially, at this particularly around harvesting hope element, bring in things around time and coping imagery that we talked about in the first webinar. So again, thinking to themselves around, in 6 months' time, in a year's time, what will you feel proud of in terms of how you've managed in the here and now? The third point in this model is around reauthoring. And this is about those, what I mentioned before around those emotions, that personal narrative, the story we're telling ourselves. And remember, the voice in our head is the loudest voice we listen to. So this is about us really supporting the processing of what they've been experienced, but helping them to understand how they're framing that, the lens through which they're seeing it, but then also telling it to themselves is really important to pick up and explore, because underlying and underpinning a lot of that will be about their beliefs about themselves and other people as well. And actually, it's about supporting people to help balance their thinking and to understand where there might be thinking habits that are contributing to their narrative that might be hindering how they are processing and dealing with what they have or are experiencing at the time. And as you can see, as we move on to the fourth element, which is around identifying change, there is a gradual journey that we've taken them on through the use of this framework. So moving from understanding the here and now to actually what can you see as the glimmers of hope and opportunity? What are you telling yourself that's keeping you where you are now and in that thought? And moving on then to starting to think about moments where there might be opportunities to implement elements of change or new patterns of behaviour or new things that might again support them in recovery. So I've mentioned here around using a diary, so again noting down, and it might be at that point asking individuals to note down each day what's the one or two things that they that were good points throughout their day, or getting to reflect on their emotions through the day. So actually what starting to kind of recognise where there were some slight I'm going to say highs and lows, but obviously some points that were good and others were flat. So again, getting people to recognise, but also to start to develop those habits where they can start to document and understand where they are showing strengths, and also it's the progression of that recovery. So again, it's the movement of time and how they are continuing to cope and to practice their resilience to move forward. The next one is around valuing change. So this is around placing some personal significance on the changes that they want to pursue in terms of looking after themselves or how they're working or the habits that they're creating for themselves to move forward. So this is very much about helping to connect what they're wanting to do with what are some of their core values that drive them in the work they do. And often this will connect to their sense of purpose, what really is the reason that they get up and go to bed every day. And within the context that we're working within health and social care, so much about that is about being at their best for others, be that their teams, their patients, their colleagues. It's about making a difference. It's about all of those core values. So seeing how through the changes they're making for themselves, support them to be at their best. The values around how that then helps people that they work with and they're equally supporting, helps them to recognise the importance of that self-care to help them be at the best for other people as well. So again, that valuing change is about linking what they're doing to their values, but also the importance of that for them. And then finally, it's about that final point is really about expressing that change in terms of an action. So again, gently, what are those small incremental steps or actions or commitments they're going to make in that coaching session to do tomorrow or to try? And again, it's thinking about, for me, I always advocate it's about those incremental accumulative steps that really help, rather than thinking about I've got to go from here to here. It's about what's that one small step I can take. Is it about starting to just really acknowledge what are the 3 things that went well at the end of the day when I'm driving home, and getting used to that pattern and that habit of reminding myself, actually, I've got through another day and this is what I've achieved and this is where I am and this is what I feel good about. So that's an overview of the Thrive model. I'm just going to ask Kerry now. So I know, Kerry, as a coach, thoughts around using that model and its application?
Yeah, I definitely have a few that I can share with you. So one that was going through my head, and I know at the beginning that you said you wouldn't necessarily go through this in a linear way. You might pick out different parts, but it's pulling it all together. So just reflecting on the fact that I was working with somebody who, when we came to action, we ended up having a conversation where they were saying action, and we realized between us that what they were saying was that they wanted to understand. The purpose of the session was to understand rather than to act on anything at that point. So, and I was thinking actually in crisis and recovery, I can imagine that some of that sense making is going to be really important. So there might be times when change in action might not be as appropriate. Would that be right?
Yeah, completely. And exactly. And I think, you're always driven by the needs of the person in front of you and where they are currently, and by also as a coach, your own experience and judgment on the extent to which you feel or you agree with them around what that envelope of stretch is at that time. And that's going to vary depending on where people are in that period of processing, sense making and debriefing. So you make a really valid point that actually the goal isn't about getting to, expressing changes and action. Actually, it's about your whole coaching session might be around the first 3 things, around the understanding where they are, what supports around them, what are they drawing on, recognizing what they're doing to cope at the moment. It's around the hope around, this is a point in time, and actually getting them to see glimmers of that, and then the reauthoring. So it's not unrealistic that actually a lot of that coaching conversation might be focused at those first 3 elements, for example, and a combination of those. So yes, I think the goal isn't action. I think ultimately, if you're having multiple sessions over time, you as a coach will hopefully see the progression of someone. And actually a lot of the percolating down of the thoughts and the processing and the coming to may happen even after your coaching session, when they leave and they've got time to reflect and think about and go through what they covered with you. You might find that at their subsequent session, they're coming back with examples of what they might have tried or what they've taken from that kind of safe space that you've created with them in the moment.
Yeah, and I think that sort of goes back to the other question that was going through my head, which was around this very definitely seems to me like a recovery tool, because you're thinking about the future, you're helping them work that through, which, and we haven't really talked so much about this on these sessions, but which might be different from just decompression, where you're just listening and allowing them to just work it out and say it out loud.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part. I suppose the tools that we've shared with you on this focus around the psychological growth through adversity, because it's almost the acknowledgement that if people have lived through something that's been incredibly distressing or uncomfortable, it is about recovery, but they're not going to be the same person they were before they experienced COVID and working in a ward where they were looking on. So they will be, and it's about what's the growth in that progression of them as people, as professionals and individuals. So it's supporting them to recognise and harness that growth, that psychological growth, through experiencing what have been really distressing, uncomfortable, incredibly challenging moments in their life.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, well, the other model, and Kerry, this links to your point really around this being very much a recovery-based model. To the second model that I'm going to share with you, which some of you coaches may have already really familiar with, but this is the Oscar model, and this is very much a solutions-focused tool to use. Again, obviously, clearly psychologists love acronyms. So Oscar stands for a 5-point scale, and what you will see when I briefly just talk about it is that the role play that Kerry and I did in one of the webinars draws out a number of the elements from both the Thrive and the Oscar model. But the Oscar model is quite useful again, and I would suggest that the Thrive and the Oscar, you will know based on the needs of your coachee when in their journey you might want to lean on one more than or the other, depending on where they are in their processing of what they're going through. So with the Oscar, the O stands for outcome, which is really useful for grounding the session and being really focused on what the purpose and what people want to get from their discussion and what they're doing it. The S is around scale, and I think this is useful for both the coach and the coachee to help. It's a way of quantifying either the importance, the significance, the thought, the feelings around a particular experience, challenge, what they're dealing with. And I think many of us can sometimes use a scale to say, okay, where are you? What value would you give it in terms of where you are now? You might say, I'm a 5, and then you might ask a question, well, where would you want to be? Where's your goal? And you might say, well, I want to be about an 8 or a 9. And I think when we're coaching within this context, I think we can use the scale in a way to help people say, okay, so you're saying you're a 5 now, what would a 6 look like? And asking people to think, actually, what's one step forward? Because sometimes saying, actually, well, how am I going to go from 5 to 9? That seems too much. I'm too overwhelmed at the moment. But actually, one step forward, yeah. So I can think about that. That feels more manageable. Equally, the other thing, and you will have seen Kerry and I have this discussion in our role play, asking people around the value they've given. So, for example, if someone said, well, actually, normally I'm a 7. At the moment, I'm feeling at about a 4. Asking someone, okay, so why is it not lower? What is it about how you're being that puts you at a 4 and not a 1? And again, that realization of, actually, and what are the things that I'm still doing that people may not be consciously aware of until you draw it out of that coaching conversation with them. The K stands for the knowledge and resources. And again, you can see the link back to the Thrive model. So again, helping people harness what skills, resources, knowledge, experiences, physical, psychological, social support in terms of the knowledge and resources they currently have that they could bring to bear on the challenge or the issue they're facing at the moment. I often have a phrase when I work with groups, the answer's in the room. And I think with coaching, it's very similar. The answers are within the individual, and our role of coaches is to kind of draw those out of people. So really, that's the case about helping people find those ideas, those solutions, those next steps themselves through how we support them through our questioning. The A stands for affirm and action. So I think one of the most powerful things that we often do as coaches is we play back what someone says back to them. So we will use their exact language. And I think when they hear someone else say back to them what they just said, the realization of, wow, that's quite powerful, or I think can be a really useful way of helping people acknowledge and affirm all that they're currently doing or trying to do or thinking about or juggling or dealing with, and being able to, you as that independent person, affirm what you've heard back to them, but equally support them in thinking about, again, what are those small incremental actions that they might want to take to continue moving forward positively. And then finally, around the review, it's just that opportunity in that discussion to review what's been covered, what's been discussed, the journey the conversation's gone through, and ultimately where you've arrived at. So what has been what are the 3 things you're taking from this conversation? What's really stood out to you in terms of how we've had this conversation and what you recognize through our discussion. So again, helping that review process so people can recognize the thought process and the process they've gone through during their discussion with you. So I'm going to pause there. Kerry, what's your thoughts around that Oscar model, and also in comparison to the Thrive model that we've also discussed?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage anybody who wants to see this in action to look at the role play that we did previously, because I think we used a lot of this in there, didn't we? Which was really helpful for me at the time. And as you covered, that whole bit about looking 1 point higher was really insightful. I guess I was thinking here that the affirm and action. So of course we'll be checking in on the level of challenge with people. What I've found in coaching at the moment, there has been something about people's level of challenge has been different. And sometimes they might not realize that at the time we're saying, how do you feel about challenge? And they'll be, yeah, I'm up for challenge. But there might be something else as well, because we're talking about recovery, we're talking about crisis. So I guess I'm mindful of that bit. So I like the affirm and action, because whilst we're reflecting back their own language, I guess quite often I would be using that. I might use that in more of a challenge as well. So I heard you say this, but even reflecting back at them, it can sometimes be quite a challenge. So being able to affirm and action, then I think that has a slightly different implication to it. So I liked that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because I think, and we touched on this in the first webinar, but one of the elements around when we're coaching through crisis and recovery, there is an element around validation, which I think as coaches we might not utilize as much in under normal circumstances as we might now, but validating the emotions that people are feeling at the moment. So obviously without any judgment, but recognizing and validating what they're doing and why they're doing, because I think the complexity of what people are feeling around fear, guilt, multiple roles, pressure, exhaustion, and that low level of expectation, all within the context of the uncertainty of the new normal, I think is really important. So your point about almost recalibrating appetite for challenge and stretch is really important, because someone it's about we're coaching in a very different context at the moment. So again, it's around that individualized need about where someone is and in terms of what they can deal with at the moment and what they need from that coaching session with you.
Absolutely. And my thoughts, as I was listening to you there, my thoughts were turning to actually what is the purpose of this coaching. And we're talking about coaching during crisis and recovery. So although it's not a clear-cut line, we are coaching to support our staff in crisis and recovery, and that's the primary purpose, rather than personal development, where we might be really focusing in a different way on the level of challenge for them. That's a possibility that was going through my head. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think going back to what we said originally around particularly the post-event or post-traumatic growth coaching approach, it focuses almost exclusively on 3 elements, which is processing, so understanding their experiences and working through those. It's around sense making, so sense making about their own emotional reactions, how they've emotionally responded, and also how they now view themselves within the context of their world and their role in it. And then finally, a degree of debriefing. So again, just around what their realizations from sort of being either through on the other side of what they're doing. And I know that this is included in the resource pack, but often when people have experienced really distressing, uncomfortable events in their life, they typically, things around the value they place on their relationships almost is increased. How they view themselves and the values and what they realize is important to them is also maximized in terms of some of the psychological positives that can come out of that, and how they view what's important going forward, what do they want in their lives going forward. So I think some of these experiences yield almost a refocusing or a reminding of actually what really matters. And again, how those conversations surface through coaching, again, is useful to think of. And there's more detail around those elements within the resource pack that accompanies these webinars.
Great, thanks Rebecca once again for that today and for the working through that. I just want to remind everybody out there that if you are following this channel and look at the other resources available, you've got a resource pack. We've done a CPD session on coaching in crisis and recovery. We have the role play session, which Rebecca mentioned earlier, and today's deep dive into the models. There are also there's also a video and some toolkit and some questions for line managers on coaching conversations during crisis and recovery that you might want to take a look at. So thank you for your time in working with us today. Do feel free to get in contact with us at the contact details below, and we look forward to your comments for the future. Thanks so much. Bye from me.
Bye-bye. Thank you.